Hi everyone. Hola a todos. Esta versión es un poco extraña, es bilingüe. This is a bilingual version of a conference. Here we are with Karlien, Franco and Mariana Montes. They are from Lovaina. Ellas son de bueno, una es de Córdoba y la otra es de Lovaina. Y vamos a hacer una transmisión, ya les digo, bilingual. Es this is a bilingual streaming. And you can listen in the English, in the original language here in this link, and you can listen to the Spanish version in the other window. If you don't see it, you can reach it in the programs. Si ustedes quieren ver la versión en español, tienen que hacer clic en la versión que dice en el programa, versión en español, y acá vamos a verlo en lengua original. Tenemos dos intérpretes que son Valeria Dorrego y Pilar Petrone. Ellas están en la versión en español y bueno, van a contar todo esto que yo les estoy diciendo y también van a hacer la traducción, la interpretación simultánea de la información. So, if you want to read the biodatas from the lecturers, are down below. You can click there and see the biodatas and the resume of the conference, and you can read the whole program only in the Spanish version, también also down below. So here we are. Let's begin. The show begin. Here you are with Karlien, Franco and Mariana Montes.
Thanks. Thank you, Nuria. Wait.
Hold on. Don't worry.
Okay, there it is. Okay, so I am Mariana Montes.
I'm Karlien Franco. Yeah.
We're going to talk about Nephological semantics, which is the name of our research project. Yes, many more people inside the project. We are just two of them. If you just Google Nephological semantics in English, you will certainly find our research group. So you can look it up if you want. And we are going to talk about the theoretical and methodological background in the research that we are performing in this research group. So we're going to do both introduction to all the theoretical part, which overlaps with some of the theoretical frameworks that you may have heard in previous presentations yesterday. And then also the methodology, which is corpus-based. So you may have already heard about similar things in the previous presentations, but also with some computational methods that have not been discussed yet. So and the presentations, as you saw in the title, was in English and in Spanish. The whole slides are going to be bilingual, since this is a bilingual presentation. So you will see here, for example, we have a heading to the left in English, to the right in Spanish. And when there is text, it's going to be left English, right Spanish, everything translated by me. When we have examples, they're going to be in Dutch, and the examples will be translated to both English and Spanish. And when there's titles, they're going to be also both languages, so you should be able to follow in any case. So what our research does is take a concordance that most of you will have heard of or seen already in previous presentations, so a list of instances of words, and tries to extract the structure fully automatically with computational methods that do things with the corpus, extract information from what is going on with the text, and try to represent the structure of the different occurrences, the kinds of context that we find, and we're trying to extract semantic interpretations from the structure. The structure looks like a graph, like what you see in the right, which we call clouds, and that's why it's nephological semantics, because nepho means clouds. These are very colorful plots, and we have very interesting visualizations. We're going to discuss here the results more than the actual visualization, but I hope you're going to be you'll have enough to learn with all the theoretical part, the methodology. There has been some computational applications discussed yesterday in another presentation, the one by TechLink. In this case, we offer a product, but we're going to talk a lot here about what is going behind it, because we're interested in how we can use techniques that result in very interesting computational stuff, how you can use the techniques for actual lexical semantics research. So the outline of our presentation, we're going to start with some theoretical and methodological background. So Karlien is going to talk about cognitive semantics and cognitive social linguistics. So they will have some overlap, for example, with the presentations by the people from Alico yesterday, but we're also going to add a few more things. Then I will discuss a bit about our perspective in empirical research, which should be point 2 and 3, and distributional semantics, which is the most concrete methodological approach that we have. So empirical research broadly and distributional semantics more concretely. Then in the second part, we're going to talk about semasiological variation, and then the third one, onomasiological variation. And in each of them, Karlien will introduce the more theoretical parts, and then I will illustrate with a specific case study and some plots and show you how you can use the methodology that we have been developing, what kind of uses you could have with a case study in Dutch on temperature terms. You may have also heard semasiology and onomasiology in some talks yesterday. So the first one, for example, talk about semasiological and onomasiological dictionaries. In this case, we talk about those adjectives apply to variation and research approaches. But in any case, everything will be explained in the corresponding slides in the future. Yeah, theoretical and methodological backgrounds.
Yeah, so basically the framework that we're working in is cognitive semantics. So cognitive semantics, which you may be familiar with, is a theory of semantics. So it's really all about meaning. It starts from meaning, and it assumes that meaning is very central to language and to linguistic structure. And well, this is not surprising, but if you consider other approaches to linguistics, like generative approaches, where language is, for instance, seen as a collection of syntactic rules and how rules combine, etc., this is a point that can be stressed enough. So rather than considering language as a system of rules, cognitive semantics really gives a central role to meaning and to how linguistic structures are used to express or highlight certain aspects of meaning, for example. So following this view, cognitive semantics and also cognitive linguistics in general defines meaning in a very maximalist way, so a very broad way. So rather than, again, like in generative approaches, trying to draw a line between competence and performance or semantics and pragmatics, cognitive semantics really assumes that it's impossible to draw a line like that, but that meaning cannot be reduced to something like truth values or necessary and sufficient conditions or something like that. So meaning is a lot broader, it's very maximalist. So this is basically the basic point of cognitive semantics. And then there are 4 more specific characteristics of the view on meaning in cognitive semantics that are often mentioned. So if they are, for instance, mentioned by Dirk Gerards, one of our colleagues, in the introduction to his volume on basic readings in cognitive linguistics. And the first one of these characteristics is that meaning is dynamic and flexible. And this characteristic really emphasizes the point that meanings can change. So depending on the situation that you're in or even who you're speaking with, you can use words, for instance, in new ways and people will still understand you. So a simple example would be thinking about the word mouse. So right now we're all sitting at a computer. So if I say mouse, you're probably thinking of a computer mouse like this one. And this is actually a newer meaning of the word. So it only came about in the last few decades when computers started to exist. But if we think of the meaning of the word mouse or of the word mouse in a different context, for instance, if you see your cat chasing some small animal, you would probably interpret the word in a very different way. So it's not very likely that your cat would be on the hunt for a computer mouse, but they would be probably looking for something to eat instead. So the animal mouse. And so this fact that meanings are really flexible, depending on the context that they're used in and also by who they're used. This is an obvious fact probably for linguists, but it's still crucial to emphasize because the view in cognitive linguistics or cognitive semantics is really not that meaning is that meaning is not static, not unmutable, and not easily defined. So it's very dynamic and flexible, and we will also see that in our case studies later. So that's the first characteristic. Then the second one is that meaning is perspectival. So everything that we say is embodied, and it mirrors some perspective that we have of reality, or that we take on reality while we speak with people. And in the chapter by Dorrego, spatial concepts are used to explain this further. So for instance, if you put your bike near the front entrance to your house, but you're in your back garden, there are several ways to describe that scene. So you could say my bike is in front of the house, and then you would emphasize the viewpoint of someone who is standing on the street in front of your house and looking at your house. So then you can say my bike is in front of the house, but you can also say my bike is behind the house. Sorry, if you say it's in front, yeah. But you can also say my bike is behind the house, and then you're emphasizing your own point of view. When you're in the backyard and you look at your house, your bike is behind it. So this is how you can, or how language can use different perspectives to describe the same scene. Then the third characteristic that is sometimes mentioned is that meaning is considered to be encyclopedic and not autonomous. And this relates to the fact that words or concepts are not just defined by linguistic knowledge, as dictionary definitions, for instance, but we also use non-linguistic knowledge that we have by experience with the world and with people in the world and with things in the world. So human beings are not just walking brains, but we exist in some specific social cultural environments, and everything that we know about the world and about how it works also influences how we talk and think about things. And then finally, another important point to stress is that cognitive linguistics, cognitive semantics, is a usage-based theory. So this means that there is a general belief that meaning and language are not innate properties of human, but that they are acquired or learned through usage and through experience with other people using language, basically. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, and I'm following this fourth point, so that that meaning is also usage-based and experience-based. There were a number of scholars in cognitive linguistics who are mentioned at the bottom here, like Fabian Hopper, Dubrovska and Diviak, Dorrego himself, etc., who emphasize that for a usage-based theory to take itself seriously, it really needs to base itself on empirical data for linguistic analyses. So to understand how language is constructed and how it may vary or change, we really need to use natural data to come to our conclusions. However, once you start talking or taking into account naturalistic empirical data rather than relying on introspective methods, for instance, you immediately have to deal with the fact that empirical data is always sociolectally structured in some way. So, for example, slide. Thank you. So any data set that you may find will be influenced, of course, by things that are specific for people who are using the language. So for the language users in the data, and this is a point that might seem quite familiar if you're familiar with sociolinguistic research, for example, because in sociolinguistics, the aim of the field is really to analyze linguistic data in function of social properties of the language users involved. So this could be their gender, or their socioeconomic backgrounds, or any other sort of macro social category like register, which you can see here. Or style differences may even play a role. So for instance, in communities of practice where people will develop their own way of speaking, basically, or at least they use variation to show who they are, basically. Or what may also play a role is geographic location, of course, which is typically studied in dialectology or dialectometry. And so there are all these different ways in which language can be stratified, as we call also structured along one of these axes of variation. And because we believe that this is important, we prefer to talk about lexical variation rather than just social lexical variation, to really emphasize that it's quite a broad way, or there are many ways in which language can vary, basically. So then, to take empirical research seriously, it's really important that you also pay attention to language variation, because empirical materials will always also be lexically stratified, just like languages. And so variation within your data should be included in the analysis, because you will always have variation in your data, and so you should take it into account. And then the theoretical framework that we're working in, which is shown on the next slide, is cognitive social linguistics. And this is a framework that really brings all these things together. So it works against the framework of cognitive linguistics, cognitive semantics, and it puts a central place for meaning in a very maximalist form and also flexible form, as I discussed earlier. And then secondly, it also explicitly focuses on lexical features that correlate with language variation. And finally, it programmatically is usage-based, so it really relies solely on empirical data for linguistic analyses. So then I will give the floor to Mariana.
Yeah. So what do we talk about what do we mean when we say empirical research? And that's the kind of, what underlies our methodological approach. So here rely on a paper by Dirk Gerards as well, called The Doctor and the Semantician. This is a very interesting exploration of the characteristics of empirical research, particularly when applied to linguistics. So these are there are some main characteristics that he points out of empirical research. The first one is that it's data-driven. So like Karlien has already mentioned, we have the empirical data, things that are observable, and that's what we are using. In contrast, for example, with a lot of introspective research, which is kind of like of armchair research in a sense, of just thinking of examples or trying to just dig into your mind what you think is going on. Even if there is always some introspection, and I'm going to really emphasize it at the end of this slide, how important the introspection is not used as a means of obtaining the data that we're going to analyze. So we are based on the things that are happening, the data that you can observe or study. It can be observational, which is the case, for example, of corpus linguistics, which I'm going to talk about later a bit more, because that's the main source of our data. It can also be experimental. And each of them has their pros and their cons and focus on different aspects of what data-driven empirical research can be. So in observational data and corpus data, you have more authentic, like spontaneous information that is happening at that moment, and you can see how frequently people use things. And in experimental settings, you have more control about certain things that are happening, and that's so we have control of certain variables. You can control who is speaking or different characteristics. So each of those methods will give you a different overview, and it's often very important to be able to bring them into dialogue, to have interdisciplinary research, for example, that can contrast what you obtain from corpus data with what you obtain from experimental data. In this case, in any case, we're focusing on observational material, so on corpus data. Another very important characteristic of empirical research is the role of the hypothesis. So that seems also very basic, but let's look a bit into that. You have a research question, you have something that you want to find out, and you draw a hypothesis. You think of what the possible answer to the research question is. Now, there is a stage where this hypothesis, which is probably very high conceptually, very abstract, you have to bring it to the terms of your data. You have to operationalize it, which means translating basically the hypothesis in terms that are compatible with the kind of data in measurable terms. So, for example, we want to analyze senses and meaning, but meaning is not something measurable, it's not something really observable. So you have to find in the kind of data that you obtain, either experimental data or in this case, observational data, what in terms of that data can you use, what can you measure, what can you observe that is a proxy or a parallel of a way of finding meaning or studying meaning. And this operationalization part is very important because you can have very grand abstract ideas, and if you don't know how to translate it into things that you can actually see in your data, then there's nothing going on there. And it does require a lot of creativity, as Jerez points out and emphasizes in this paper. So you have a lot of very maybe hard quantitative stuff and seems like you're automatizing everything, but just the thinking of the hypothesis, that looking at the theory and thinking what you expect to see in the data and figuring out how to translate that into something that you can see in the data, then running the analysis and then looking and interpreting the data itself and figuring out what that means for your hypothesis. That's a lot of work that really requires interpretation and hard thinking and creativity. And that's the kind of things where we want the human forces to focus, so to speak. So one of our roles is to give everything that the computers can do better than us, like in finding patterns. So they do all that hard work that for us is very tiring and really not very rewarding. If you have done manual annotation, you understand what I'm talking about. And instead, let all our energies focus on this empirical cycle, which is you have an idea, you have your theory, based on that theory on previous research, you formulate your hypothesis, you figure out how to translate it into measurable terms, measurable things that you can find in the data, you analyze your data, you interpret your results. Maybe they confirm your hypothesis, maybe they don't. And if they don't confirm the hypothesis, is the hypothesis wrong or is the operationalization wrong? Is your whole theory wrong? What do we have to adjust? And then you adjust the hypothesis or the theory or the operationalization and go again to data analysis. And that's something that sometimes gets overlooked because a paper, when you read a research paper, is normally very neat, an introduction, and here's the question and the hypothesis, method, and the results, and that's it. And sometimes you find something that shows you the negative results, but normally you'll have positive results. And if you just read papers, you might not realize how much of research is back and forth between data analysis and interpretation and formulating hypotheses, and how much creativity there is in actually achieving that at all. So we want to emphasize how here also we have a lot of hard quantitative stuff that looks in empirical research and how it interacts with the the creative parts of the researchers, how introspection is useful and necessary in this case, and interpretation mostly. So we're using mainly corpus methods, which are mostly quantitative methods. So you have seen in previous talks, if you gone to private talks, there has been mention of corpora, which are collections of naturalistic data, normally huge collections of naturalistic data, so not just 3 pages or an essay, but normally with millions and millions of words, where you can see a lot of patterns of usage. So that allows you to perform empirical research, so you can see the corpus, and it's usage-based because you can see how people are currently using the language or are using the language when they're producing those texts. It's authentic, it's more or less spontaneous. There will be some editing, and then that's another thing. And as Karlien mentioned before, it opens up for lectal variation. So this kind of usage data necessarily has lectal variation. And with lectal variation, we include regional lectal variation, chronolectal variation, dialectal variation. So all the different dimensions in which language can vary. So different registers, different genders of people speaking, different stages in time. And you either have a corpus that varies along different dimensions, and then you can study how that occurs. So you could have, for example, a historical corpus with text from the 1500s up to today, and then you can do research of how language changes a deal. Or you could have a corpus of a very specific time span. For example, we are going to show research of a corpus that goes from 1999 to 2004. And that doesn't really allow you to see how language changes in time. But then you have to be specific about the time that you're studying. And so you can say that your results are particular to that time and might not really be generalizable to other times. Maybe they are, or maybe they are not. But that's also a very important thing of empirical research that really allows for reproducibility of what you're doing. So when you have research of this kind, where you're also objectify, like being very objective, so to speak, about different aspects of your research. So you can say, in the case of the case studies we're going to show, we use a Dutch corpus. So a corpus of Dutch and Flemish newspapers, which are in Dutch. We have a proportion of popular newspapers, quality newspapers. They stem from 1999 to 2004. It's written text from the journalistic genre. So you give all this information, and that allows someone to replicate your study, either in the same circumstances or in comparable circumstances or in different circumstances, and they can make comparison about the results to the degree to which they agree with what you did or not, or how what you did can or not be applied to different situations. So lectal variation is a key component of corpus-based research, in that either you include it in your corpus and then you can use it as a variable in the things that you're going to look into, or you are restricting the object of your study to a specific form, so to a specific genre or a specific register, a specific time span, and you can say to what specific characteristics your research applies or doesn't apply, and then compare it with others in other research studies. And finally, corpus methods offer an extensional perspective. And this just simply means that it looks at the different cases, different occurrences of elements, and not a different. So if you can have an intentional description of a category in which you have, for example, the different senses or features that define that category, or when you have an extensional perspective, you describe a category based on its members. So you could say that a fruit is something sweet, that fruits are sweet and have a certain kind of size and typically grow on trees and so on. And that's an intentional description. And an extensional description of fruit is banana, apple, orange, mango, etc. So that is the kind of perspective the corpus method offers you. Finally, before going into the specific method that we're going to look into, which is distributional methods, I would like to make a note in the relationship between empirical and quantitative methods. You could do empirical research that looks at actual data, for example, by doing discourse analysis on a certain number of discourse, without really having quantitative analysis, without having frequencies of, so without discussing the frequency with which something happens, for example. So that is totally possible. It is compatible. But in this case, we go for an empirical research with quantitative methods in corpora, because quantitative methods allow you to make conclusions or inferences about large amounts of data. So instead of 2 or 3 texts, you can have observations about the tendencies across many texts, many instances about what many people are doing. And so your conclusions are a bit more solid in that they describe what many people are doing and not what one person did at some point exactly, which is a different kind of result. So both of them are complementary to a degree. Quantitative methods also are very compatible with prototype theory, which Karlien is going to explain soon, in which, and with this quantitative turn of cognitive linguistics, in which we don't only focus on things that happen or don't happen, but also on how often they happen, or on the weight of the different features or things that are going on. So one of the things of prototype theory that we're going to see is that in a category, you have elements that are central and elements that are peripheral. You have features that more strongly define a category, and features that don't define it as well. For example, you have tendencies, you have words that prefer to have this sense and not so much this other sense. or you have concepts that prefer to be expressed in with a certain word and not with another word. So the fact that we are talking about tendencies and frequencies and weights instead of categorical yes or no, this or that, that is something central to cognitive linguistics, and quantitative methods really give us the approach that allows us to see tendencies across large amounts of data of how this is going on. So, what is distributional semantics, which is the precise methodology that we are going to use? This is going to seem probably very strange and alien to linguists that don't have much contact with quantitative methods or good computational methods, but just breathe deeply and you'll get there, don't worry. So the basic theoretical perspective or a hypothesis, we could say, that underlies the distributional models that we're going to talk about is a distributional hypothesis, which states that similarity of distribution correlates with the similarity of meaning. This can be found in Harris, 1954, but also Fierce, who famously said, "You shall know a word by the company it gives," in 1957. This is a very famous motto of that it underlies corpus linguistics in general, but also distributional semantics in particular. And the idea is that when two words have very similar meanings, they are also going to have very similar textual distribution. So they're going to co-occur with similar words or in the similar contexts. And this is a distribution that underlies our operationalization of meaning. So if the distributional hypothesis is correct, and so, for example, you could say that apple and orange are words that are semantically related, and they're probably going to occur in the same context, such as I went to the grocery store and bought an orange, or I ate an orange and I'm eating or I'm drinking orange juice, and so on. And those things can be used with orange and with apple, and those are similar contexts. And because the words can occur in the similar context, they can occur in similar contexts because they are semantically similar, or, well, at least those two things correlate. It would be harder to say I went to the grocery and bought a mouse, or I drank some mouse juice, or I am eating a mouse. In that sense, those contexts make apple and orange be similar, but very different to mouse. Well, that's more or less the idea. And in that sense, when we have this idea about looking at different senses, then our question is, can we then operationalize senses as these distributional profiles that we're going to build? How do we do that? You may recall from yesterday's first talk when it was talked about collocations. So collocations are words that co-occur significantly frequently. They are attracted to each other because they occur together much more frequently than they would if it was just randomly there by chance. So they are words that are friends. They prefer to hang out together. They are calculated by checking how often they occur together compared to how often they occur with other words. Normally, when we talk about collocations, we have this list of words and all the association strength with all the other words in the corpus. And when you look at, for example, with AntConc or Sketch Engine or any other program or platform that shows you collocations, what they do is rank the collocations by those values and give you the top values, or give you those that are above a threshold. So in this case, for example, we have linguistics in English based on a corpus of global word Englishes. And we have its values of its association strength with language, word, English, speak, Flemish, and eat. And if you were just going to a platform that gives you collocations, it would say, oh, language and English have a PMI, these are mutual information, higher than 3, and so these are collocates. And word, speak, Flemish, eat are not even going to show up. In our case, we're going to use the full list or a big chunk of the list, and what we care is not only about the actual collocates, but about the association strengths with many different words. So the ups and downs, the friends and the enemies, all of them. And that's how we make a word vector. So a vector is here a string of numbers. And so the word of vector is representing the word. So imagine that someone that Facebook is looking at all your interactions with your friends and can make a profile of you based on how often you talk with each of your friends, basically like that. So here we have mutual information. Don't worry if you don't really understand the formula, but if you do, great for you. In which we take how often the words occur together. So in this corpus, linguistics occurs 20,000 times, and language occurs like 158,000 times, and they occur together 285 times. We use that information and the size of the corpus, that's the n, but it doesn't matter to put it there right now. We use that information to get to the value 4.37. So 4.37 is the association strength between linguistics and language. Now what we do later is have this strength not only of the friends, but all the relationships between linguistics and many other words. And we do the same for other words that we are interested in. We can do it for lexicography, for computational, for research, for chocolate. I didn't translate this in tables because we are talking about English words, not something, it's the English word form. And that's also a very important thing when we're talking about corpus. The computers here are representing a word as a string of numbers, and the numbers are the occurrences of the word with other words. But those words are forms, are things that are written on a file, and the corpus knows that this is a word because there's a space before and a space after, which is not by any means the only way of defining a word, but is the way that we right now can communicate with the computer, and that doesn't take too much work. Because if we wanted to say, no, you have to take off course as one word, then that's a lot of extra computation to identify that automatically. So here we have a word which the word research is not investigación, it's research because it's from an English corpus. So we have linguistic, lexicography, computational, research, chocolate, and we have their profiles based on how attractive they are to language, word, English, speak, Flemish, eat, etc. Each of them has different values based on how often they co-occur with these words, and then we can compare them to each other based on those values. So you can see that linguistics and lexicography have very similar values with language, with English, with speak, with word, and neither of them co-occurs close to Flemish and eat. Here isn't a word of 4 and 4 words to either side. So in the full corpus, Flemish never shows up close enough to linguistics to be here. This is the case. If you have a larger window, then probably the numbers would be different. So each row in this table is the vector of the word that we have, this target. And it aggregates over all the occurrences. So this is a vector of all of linguistics in that corpus. Then the full vector of all of lexicography in that corpus. And at the end, the vector of all of chocolate in that corpus, which you can see is very different from the one of linguistics. Linguistics and chocolate are very different because they occur with different contexts. I don't know if you get it there. What we also do because of technical things is all the numbers that are negative, that are supposed to mean, that the words reject each other, basically, they are enemies, we turn them to 0. And then you have an effect, like in this case, between linguistics and chocolate, where the positive values in linguistics are 0s for chocolate and the other way around. And that's called orthogonal, or, well, like if it was perpendicular, which means that linguistics and chocolate, based on these words, are as different from each other as they could possibly be. Normally, we wouldn't have 6 words in the columns. We would have thousands or tens of thousands, yes? But this is to illustrate how we are doing it. So this is what it's called type level vectors, because each of the rows represents a type. So linguistics as it occurs across the full corpus. But what if we wanted to study polysemy? So we don't care just about linguistics, we care about the different senses or uses of linguistics, the internal structure of linguistics. We cannot recover that from that specific vector. And we want to study polysemy, so how do we do that? We make token level vectors. So vectors that represent instances or occurrences of a word. So We have here examples. Would you like to study linguistics? They study this in computational linguistics too, and I eat chocolate while I study. Here I translated the sentences, so you have an idea of what I'm talking about, but I'm still going to show the results, so the values for English to study. I also gave a presentation in Spanish where I'm doing it with estudiar, so these examples pretty much, and with actual frequencies from Spanish corpus. So here you have the link there down under the slides, or you can ask me later for the link to the slides where you can see if you're interested in the actual frequencies in the Spanish case from a corpus of Spanish, which is not the same. So going back, we have the vector, here we have 3 occurrences of to study. The first one, would you like to study linguistics? We can take the word linguistics because we already have a numerical representation of linguistics and use that to represent the instance of study, the first one. And we could take computational and linguistics in the second case to represent the second study. So these are 2 vectors, linguistic and computational. So we have to bring them together. So the second instance of to study, the case of they studied this in computational linguistics too, is going to be represented by the profile of linguistics and the profile of computationals together. In this case, we're adding them together, but that's not necessarily as the authors that I added at the end, as they discussed, is not the only way you can merge them, you can multiply them, you can average them. Here we added them. That's what the difference is something to look into empirically. And this is how we merge the vectors to represent the vector of one token. And that's how we end up with our 3 tokens here. And each of them is going to have its own vector and is based on the words that we are collecting from each of them. So study 1 is represented by linguistics, study 2 is represented by computational and linguistics, and study 3 is represented by chocolate. That's not the only solution. We could also include, for example, for study 3, we could represent it with eat and chocolate, or with chocolate and while, eat, chocolate, and while. We could have a larger window. How we chose these context words would give us different results. We are not going to discuss about that because that would make this all very complicated, but that is a question. There is not only one way of defining the context and how you're going to represent your specific instances. How you define this context is going to give you different results. And one of the things that we have been looking into in the research group is that you have to look at many of those different results because they give you a wide, rich picture of the internal structure. Looking at only one result is not enough. And well, it depends on the word, how that is convenient. But yeah, one of the things that we have developed is ways of comparing the different results, which are called different models. Now we're going to assume that there is one very obvious, clear answer, and we're going to work with that. So how does this end? We started with an original text, 3 tokens. Would you like to study linguistics? They study this in computational linguistics too, and I ate chocolate while I study. And we can use these 3 sentences to understand how study can be used in different contexts. We represent each of these instances with a token with the tokens in the top right corner of this slide, which is the token context matrix. A matrix is a table with numbers. And so we have a token in each row and the context words in the different columns. Then we have distances between them. So these vectors are ranges of numbers, and we can have mathematical operations because it's like they are positions in a very multidimensional plane, and you make a distance between them by using the cosine angle, which is very computational. I mean, it's very mathematical, and if you don't have much mathematical experience, this is rubbish anyway if you don't understand anything. But so you have a numerical representation, and you calculate how similar those numerical representations are to each other. And so every, you can have similar, or the opposite is the distance between them. So each token is identical to itself. So the distance is 0. If you have a distance where things that are in the same spot are 0, and when they are very far from each other is 1, right? So everything is identical to itself, so it's 0. Study 1 and study 2 are identical to each other, pretty much. Very, very similar, but not identical. So the distance is 0.01, which is very small. But then they are both complete opposites from study 3, because there are zeros in the different places. And so the distance is going to be 1. Now, this looks weird, but still you can read it. But you're not going to do an analysis of only 3 tokens. Also, we were talking about using quantitative methods, and you can look at a lot of cases and have more solid conclusions. So you normally would have hundreds of instances. In the cases of the plots that we're going to show you, we have 300 or 600 points. So how do you understand that? We use visualization. We use Disney, which I have the reference there below. And Disney is an algorithm that's going to represent, so which is each of these tokens, we have the distances between them, and it's going to try to put them in 2 dimensions. So basically build a scatter plot, so this kind of graph with points, and try to put the points that are close together in the distance matrix, so they have low values in distance, they're going to try to be together in the 2-dimensional plot. And when they're very far apart, they have large distances, they're going to be far apart in Disney visualization. And this doesn't always work. There's always some information that is missed, but that is lost, but it's still a good way of interpreting, because it's much easier to interpret a scatter plot, these clouds with different points. You can, if you follow this reasoning that we have done, that we have these sentences, and we take the context words in the sentences to represent how similar the sentences are together, so how similar their contexts are, then when you have the scatter plot, you're supposed to see that the points that are together in the scatter plot have similar contexts. And so technically they should be semantically similar. And when they're far from each other in the plot, then that means that their contexts are very different. So they are semantically different from each other. So that was the whole methodological part. And now I give the floor to Karlien for the theoretical introduction to semasiological variation.
Okay, thank you. So after this information about what distributional semantics is and how the models work, we'll get to our first case study, and this is about semasiological variation. So I believe most people will be familiar with semasiology, but just to be sure, semasiology, or taking a semasiological perspective to research or to language, basically means that you start with a word or with any other linguistic form that you might be interested in, and then you try to analyze which meanings that form can take and in which context those meanings occur. So if we take the Dutch word heet, which you see on this slide, for example, we would see that there are 4 contexts, 4 meanings that occur often, or that the word has often in context. So the first meaning is the most central one, or the most prototypical one, and that's of high temperature, just like in the English cognate hot, so very warm. And then there are 3 other meanings which are probably derived from that more central meaning, namely spicy, so about food, for instance. Then new or popular, like a hot person can be an interesting person, and also conflictive. And those are all things that we will also see in some of the models later. So then if you think about semasiological variation, we are really dealing with the fact that this one word, for instance, heet in Dutch, can have more than one meaning. So that's what we're really interested in. And there are actually several ways in which a word can have or acquire new meaning. So you have instances of polysemy or homonymy, but we also have instances of vagueness. So on the one hand, some words or word forms or other linguistic elements just have multiple meanings that are not related to each other or that are really considered according to, depending on the framework that you're working in, but separate meanings, so that may be hard-coded in the lexicon even. So for example, a bank can be both a financial institution, so the English word bank, or a piece of furniture that you can sit on. And in the case of bank, we would talk about polysemy or maybe even homonymy, because those financial and furniture meanings are really so distinct from each other that they can be considered unrelated. A person won't be thinking about a financial bank when the context is clearly that of a piece of sitting furniture. But then on the other hand, because of this flexible nature of language, we also find instances of vagueness. And this basically means that words can be pragmatically applied or used in a new context in such a way that the original meaning of the word is extended or changed or gets reinterpreted in some way. So in semantics, this is often referred to as vagueness or sometimes also ambiguity. And so an example would be when I say, my bank called me last night to say that they found my credit card, for example. If I ask you, Mariana, who I'm referring to in this case, so my bank called me last night, what would you say?
I think it's not the one of the river. It's probably the organization. Someone, actually, it's a person.
It's a person. But it's
not the building either.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the point, exactly. So we say my bank, but of course, a financial institution is not something that can pick up the phone and call someone. It's an inanimate thing. And it also cannot find a credit card anywhere. But instead, I'm using this word bank in a specific context to mean that a person who works at the bank or who often handles my financial transactions, they called me. And you can hardly say that this meaning of that the interpretation of person who works at the bank is a hard-coded meaning for the word bank in the lexicon, but instead it's derivable from the encoded financial institution sense of bank. But we still can understand this sentence because we know how the world works and we know how language works, and we can consider the context of the clause in that way. And so this would be at least in traditional semantics, they might consider this more of an example of pragmatics than of semantics per se, but in our cognitive linguistics, cognitive semantics framework, this is all part of the meaning of a word and how words can be flexibly used to create new meaning. And so these are actually the types of effects that we're interested in when we're investigating semantical variation. And it's not just for theoretical reasons that we're interested in these things, but it's really useful if you can get your computer to also recognize the way that language works in this way. Because if you would want at some point in the future your computer to be able to automatically understand a piece of text or a corpus even, it really needs to be able to understand which meaning of bank that the text is referring to, including that pragmatically inferred meaning of someone working at the bank. But there's another complication. So this seems relatively straightforward, right? You have hard-coded meanings where you can get where words can be polysmous, but you also have more pragmatic interpretations. But research in cognitive linguistics has actually shown that this distinction between polysemy and vagueness is actually not so systematic. It's not as simple as it seems, basically. But we won't go into that more today. If you have any questions about it, you can consult the references that are shown at the bottom of the slides or ask about it in the questions section. Okay, and then so next to the fact that we find these different types of semantical variation, it's also really important to take into account that not every meaning of a word is equally salient. And so earlier I already said that heet in Dutch has one more prototypical meaning, and yeah, it's also kind of the same way in the bank meaning. In the bank example, the meanings of these words are flexible and they can be changed and they're mutable. And so these properties are generally described as prototypicality effects in cognitive linguistics. And so prototypicality effects are actually quite crucial to the view on meaning in this framework. And there are 4 types of effects that have been distinguished, which can be organized along 2 dimensions, although they don't always have to co-occur. So first, prototypicality effects often relates, or one type of prototypicality effect relates to the degree of salience, so differences in typicality or representativeness between the reference that belong to some category. And then the second effect is that there's flexibility with regard to the boundaries of a category. And then the other axes that these effects can be categorized along were already mentioned by Mariana earlier. So we have the intentional level, so the level of definitions, and the extensional level, which relates basically language to the outside world, so the referential level. And so these dimensions, these axes cross-classify, as you can see in the table on the slides, which is an adaptation of a table from a book by Dorrego. And so to just explain this table in a bit more detail, I will use a standard example from prototype theory, namely the category of fruit. So Mariana already said, or she already mentioned some prototypical exemplars of fruits, like, what did you say, mango, pineapple, apple, banana,
right? With banana, an apple, and orange, but yeah.
Right. But so what would you say about a coconut, for instance? Would you say that a coconut is a type of fruit? Yes?
I would think so, yes.
Yeah, so I mean, it's pretty
Spanish
clear
is
that
my head, sorry.
it's pretty clear that apples, bananas, mangoes are more typical types of fruits than coconuts. So this is what this difference in salience, and more particularly extensional salience, is about. So this is basically the top left cell of the table. Now let's look at the bottom left cell. So differences in extensional flexibility, as it's called. So Mariana, I'm going to ask you a question again. If you think of, folk classifications, so not scientific classifications of taxonomies, but of, the way people think about the world, you would agree that fruits are often the things that are the edible, the seed-bearing parts of trees, right?
Yes.
Like apples are the seed-bearing parts of an apple tree, right? But what would you do about an olive if you knew that an olive is exactly that? It's the edible seed-bearing part of an olive tree. Well,
yeah.
Again, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking of because we talk about how this has to do with experience, and so it's like if you learn about scientifically, it's based because in Spanish we have the distinction between fruta and fruto, and fruit is the fruta, but fruto is this seed-bearing part of a plant, and fruta has more the thing of it has a specific area in the supermarket, for example. Olives are not with apples. Yes. Okay. So I think that sometimes we can use that would be an everyday criterion to think of whether something corresponds to the category of fruits or not. So olives are not with apples in the supermarket. So I would say that no, they're not efforts. You can try to convince me, but for the uses that I give olives.
Not a fruit. Okay. I would actually agree, but Mariana and I definitely had to think about it. So maybe it's not so clear that every person would consider an olive to be not a type of fruit or a part of, or a type of fruit. And this is exactly what that extensional flexibility is all about. So decisions about where a category ends and where another category may begin, and uncertainty about the membership of objects in the world for a particular category. Then let's look at the top right cell, so differences in intentional salience. And first, let's consider some of the attributes that are often shared between different types of fruits, like that they're sweet, that they're typically cooked with sugar to make jam or something, that they have a hard skin, etc., like apples and pears do. And what you see then is that the more typical types of fruit, like apples and pears, that they share more of those attributes, those features that are typical for the category, like they're edible, they're sweet, they have a hard skin. But the less prototypical members, like let's say olives again, they are different. So olives, for instance, are not sweet at all. Also depends on whether you would consider olives fruits, I guess. But if you look at mangoes, for instance, they don't have a hard skin. Neither do strawberries, for instance, which are slightly less typically fruits. And what's also interesting is that those less prototypical members also share attributes with other categories. So, for instance, a lemon, which is, it's kind of in between fruit and vegetables for me at least. It's not really sweet. Well, it's not sweet at all, but the more typical fruits definitely are. And this is usually explained by the notion of family resemblance structures, which is also mentioned on the slide. So this way that features are more or less shared between more and less prototypical members of a category. And then the final property is that intentional flexibility, and this shows up in the fact that there is no way of defining prototypical categories in a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. So in a classical lexicographical definition, basically. So for instance, so the most typical types of fruit, again, have a skin that's harder than their soft inside, like apples and pears. But if you would impose hard skin as a definitional criterion, so as something that you actually put in a definition of a type of fruit, that would exclude strawberries. So and then if you don't include it, then other types of objects in the world would get included in the category. So it's basically just impossible to come up with one definition that covers all the exemplars in the world. So that's basically what prototype theory looks like. Now, Mariana will tell you about our first semantical case study where you will see these effects at play.
Yeah, I also wanted to add, which is something that has been emphasized sometimes too, is that the category of prototypical category is the category of prototypicality is prototypically structured. So you have categories that have all these 4 characteristics, and you have some that have only 1 or only 2. So you could have absence of necessary and sufficient conditions, but without fuzziness at the edges, or difference in typicality without family resemblance. So this, or you could have all of them. So this is everything has this kind of structure in cognitive linguistics. So yeah, going to the case study, we're going to talk about heat. So that's a Dutch adjective that can be translated more or less like as hot. But we are going to see what the corpus says about how heat is used. So like I mentioned before, we are using a corpus of newspapers from the Netherlands and from Flanders, which is a Dutch-speaking section area of Belgium. So they're 2 of the most important areas where Dutch is spoken. So this newspaper, this corpus has 520 million words from newspapers from both areas, quality newspapers, and also popular newspapers. So, and they are from 1999 to 2004. We are not going to look into the lectal variation that is inside. So this would allow us to compare how heat is used in the Netherlands or in Flanders or in quality versus popular newspapers. We are not going to do that here, but the data is there if we wanted to. This is the output from what I told you about distributional semantics before. So I'm going to explain a bit what is going on here. So this is what one possible model shows. So here we took 3 words to either side of head in the corpus, and these are 300 instances of head from the corpus. We created the vectors the same way that I told you. So each concordance is represented by the type level vectors of those context words in a very small window. And then we have the instances that are similar to each other, where the contexts are very similar, are going to be together in the, let's see, yeah. They're going to be together, for example, in the plot. Then we applied another algorithm called HDBScan, which is going to look at also the same distance matrix that we had that compares where the distances between the 300 points and tries to see which form distinct groups. So this algorithm said, this green group they are similar to each other and they are different from everything else. And this one is similar to each other, or rather it's like, here there's a blob of, so suppose you go to a party and there's 300 people and everyone tries to get with the people that they know best. And so you will have like clusters of people, you will have groups of friends and people that are like, yeah, more or less friends with everyone or friends with no one. So they are just like wandering around between the groups. And this algorithm tries to identify which are groups. So when the group is, those are close together and they're surrounded by nothing or not surrounded by people that are really part of the group, then the algorithm says this is a group. And we also told them the group has to have at least 8 members. And this is what happens. And normally the results, so it depends on the word, but normally the results do not correspond to senses. So we can't look at this and say that there are 7 senses of hit. What we have is strong collocational patterns. And I'm here going to explain what those collocational patterns are. Then I'm going to show you examples of each of those patterns so you have a better idea of how they are used. And I'm going to give some suggestions, but mostly at the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk about linguistics of temperature and how we can theoretically understand what's going on here. So these groups have numbers up here, and each of the groups is mostly represented by one word, not always. Sometimes the word represents the full group, and sometimes the word represents part of the group. I'm not specifying it here, I'm going to say it verbally. And the words that are representative are here in this table on the top left, and I have it in Dutch, so in the original language. There's a word, and I have in bold, and then I have the translation to English and to Spanish, which is a literal translation, which doesn't mean that that's how you would translate it in the context. So, for example, there is this yellow group of aardappel. So here the aardappel, which is an idiomatic expression that can be translated as hot potato and papa caliente or patata caliente, and which we are going to discuss later. And therefore, with the groups that we have, some of them are idiomatic expressions. So they are captured by the model because they are really like collocational patterns, like words that go together. So we have the aardappel, the hot potato. We have a hete hangijzer, which is like a pot hanger. It's not an idiomatic expression that I've seen in other languages. There's the het onder de voeten. So it's something that is like the floor suddenly feels hot. That's the literal interpretation. And the hete adem, which is that someone is breathing hot air, hot breath in your neck. They're all over your shoulder, looking at everything that you're doing. And over-controlling, that's the image that is here. So those 5 groups, adem, hangijzer, voet, and aardappelen, are really idiomatic expressions. Then we have the case of summer, zomer, where it's not all the cases of hot summer. It can also be hot autumn or a hot, even, I don't know if it was winter, but these temporal expressions are grouped there. So the most important one is summer, but it's not the only one. And then we have words that are not very informative, like the preposition in, which is like the English preposition in, and the verb to be. And this mostly implies other kinds of constructions that we're going to see later. So like these are normally, so in is a word that occurs the most, but actually what brings these occurrences together is not really in, is a semantic field. And like we're going to see later, this is a semantic field of cooking. So we have to pour something in a hot pan, or in hot butter, in hot oil. And so in is showing up a lot in these cooking instructions, but what really brings these tokens together. So you saw how we use the type level vector. So if you had a concordance of study that occurs with linguistics and another one that uses linguistics and computational, or even lexicography, which is similar to linguistics, they're going to be together. Using this system means that the contexts don't need to be identical, they have to be similar. So this blue group is all these cases of hot food or in cooking context. And the case of the verb to be is predicative uses. So most of the cases of it are attributive, a hot food, hot apple, or whatever, but there are some cases in which it is hot. And there is not really much context of what is hot. It could be the weather, or it could be something else that is being touched, or whatever. It's not clear. But so in this case, the green group does not represent a specific sense or even really a collocational pattern, but, well, more or less a colligational pattern in the sense that it's a grammatical structure, a grammatical construction that is being represented often. So here we have some examples. And I'm going to ask Karlien to explain semantic expressions, because I am not a native Dutch speaker, so I sometimes have a hard time understanding. Also, sometimes, I don't know if you agree that they are often very characteristic of newspapers. So I think I did a similar study in Italian, and the hot potato showed up a lot, but in newspapers.
Yeah, I would never use that idiom in real life. Okay, so do you want me to just read the Dutch text first and then explain it?
So if you can, so for the audience, the first column here is the original Dutch text. The middle column is the English text, the translation, originally by me, corrected by Karlien. And then I translated also to the Spanish text. So there can be mistakes, but also the idiomatic expression. So I tried to translate it, not really as a translator would do it, but more or less literally, so that you can have an idea of a feeling of what it feels to read the hit in Dutch, but sometimes it's like Karlien is going to explain some idiomatic expressions, and they will be expressed in different way, either in English or in Dutch or in Spanish.
Yeah, so in the first example, you see that in the middle group, the new slaughterhouse feels even slacks hot breath in their neck, but this is probably either two football teams or two companies who, and the one is threatening to take over the position of the other. So the hot breath is basically some, like the one following the other, but trying to take over their position. So it's really an idiomatic use here. And then the second example with aardappel, so potato, who will end up with the hot potato of national education and the teachers on strike. It's obviously not literally a hot potato, but it's some task that they really don't want to get, like the teachers being on strike and them having to handle it.
A note there, an anecdotal note, sorry, for the potato, is that when I did the research in Italian, you have the adjective caldo to refer to hot and warm, and you have bollente, which literally means boiling, to refer to something that is very hot. So the idiomatic hot potato is with bollente, which is very hot. So you wouldn't talk there, at least in the corpus, you didn't talk about boiling potatoes. Patata bollente was this hot potato that is idiomatic. The patata calda, which the hot/warm, that's the one used for food. And I think here there are almost no cases of the literal hot potato.
No, I think you wouldn't say hot potato unless it's really hot. Yeah. Then let's have a look. So the third one is one like Mariana explains an example of a cooking token. So sear the meat in a pot in hot butter. The fourth one is really just about the heat of summer, so it's about temperature. Then the fifth one, so with foods, als het hem te heet onder de voeten wordt, is so it's translated as if it gets too hot under his feet, but it really means if it gets if he gets in trouble, basically. So it's really an idiom again. If the man gets in trouble. Then the one about the hangijzer, de pothanger, een van de heetste hangijzers in het debat. So one of the hottest pot hangers in the debate is, one of the most difficult things that they have to discuss in the debate. And then the last one with to be, with ben or zijn, is about the atmosphere being hot. So it's basically hot either in the room or outside. I don't really know where they are in this token.
Yeah, that's interesting. These cases are not. So one of the reasons to show you these examples, these examples were not taken. I didn't select them manually. This was automatically selected. This is the most central examples, the prototypical examples in terms of the model. So when we have this plot, you see that they have different degrees of intensity, the colors. And when they are like in the center of the core of each group, that's what the algorithm said, this is central for this group. That's the one that I chose here. So this is the one that should have the most information that characterizes this cluster. And you can see that even in the case of to be, it's not informative at all. And it happens that the things that there are contexts that you see in the corpus and you have no idea how to interpret them is not enough. Sometimes the model gets it right anyways. But here in the case of to be is the cases where to be was the strongest word around.
I feel like to be hot or heet zijn is something I say a lot. It's just it's a very frequent,
it can be, but then the aspects of the context that let you understand which kind of hot you're talking about or what it is that you're talking about. It's like, it is hot, and maybe you are referencing anaphorically to something in a previous sentence, or is something that is in the spoken context. And that is much harder to identify by these models. So they say, is there everywhere. So this is the group of tokens that are together, which is still interesting because it highlights a grammatical structure. So this is the predicative uses, and all the others are mostly, except for the case of foods, they're all attributive. Okay. So that was the first case study and the temperature. And now Karlien is going to talk about onomasiological variation.
This is basically the last part of our presentation, the third part about onomasiological variation. So earlier we already talked about semasiological variation. We also gave an example of how you can analyze semasiological variation with distributional models. And we notice that, or at least in the theoretical part for heat, 4 meanings are available. So the central of high temperature meaning, like in English hot, and then the conflictive, the popular, and the spicy meanings. But if you wanted to take an onomasiological approach to investigate language variation, we would do it a bit differently. We basically take the opposite approach. So starting from a meaning, like of high temperature, and then considering the forms that exist in language to refer to that meaning. So if we look at the concept of high temperature in Dutch, we would see that next to heat, there's also the word warm, which is a cognitive English warm as well. And these both words can be used for this one concept of high temperature. And then the question that we would like to answer is, in which context is one or the other variant used or preferred, or how is this concept arranged, basically? But it's a bit more complicated because warm itself is just like heat, a polysemous word. So it has this central meaning as well, which is of high temperature, but it can also mean passionate or affectionate in Dutch. And of course, this polysemy, both with heet and with warm, will complicate our onomasiological analysis because the models will have to deal with this. And so we will only want to focus on the of high temperature parts. So so if we want to do this analysis of onomasiological variation, it's actually further complicated by the fact that due to this perspectival nature of meaning, language users actually need to make choices at different levels. And these levels are represented by the conceptual and formal layers on this slide. And this is a figure, again, from De Keres from 2016, which represents how language users may go about naming that thing at the referential level, so the picture at the bottom, basically. So let's first consider the outer two arrows. Yeah. So the first step, maybe, that the language user has to take is to decide how they want to conceptualize this reference, so this picture, at the denotational level. So they can either choose for the concept breeches, so that's a type of trousers ending just below the knee. So you see that on the right-hand side. And then there's also the more general type of garment, trousers, which is any type of trousers that goes from waist to ankles and has two legs, basically two legs that cover your legs. So that's the left arrow. And so you see that there's a taxonomical relationship, right? Breeches is a type of trousers, of course. And so the language user needs to decide which concept they're going to use, the more general one, trousers, or the more specific one, breeches. And this decision is probably influenced by contextual factors, although there's not that much research on this already. But so, for example, if there are two trousers in the room and a speaker wants to ask their interlocutor for a specific pair of trousers, the one with the short legs, they will probably say breeches. But if there's a skirt and a pair of pants in the room, they will just say trousers instead, probably because the opposition between skirt and trousers is enough. And so this first step is what we call conceptual onomasiological variation. So the situation where multiple lexical categories or concepts can apply to a single reference, like the one you see here. But this is actually not really what we are interested in. Instead, we are interested in this on the slide. So the situation that I was actually describing before for where the concept of high temperature is already fixed. But the question is which specific word that exists for the concept is used in which situation. And this is what we call formal onomasiological variation. So formal versus conceptual variation. And you can see it here twice, actually. On the one hand, you have the choice between trousers and pants, which can be used for a single concept, the general concept garments extending from waist to knee or ankle, covering both knees. But the former word trousers is more typical for British English, whereas the latter one, pants, is more typically American English. So there's a lectal difference there. And then you see the other example of breeches versus knickers, which both refer to the shorter type of trousers. And then you can also investigate who uses which one of these words in which situation. And then there's actually a final complication. So of a nature that we've already discussed before. So basically next to this conceptual onomasiological variation and formal onomasiological variation, there's also semantical variation that comes into play if you want to do onomasiological research. Because as you can see right now, both pants and knickers are also polysemous words. So they can both also refer to a third concept, underpants, that is not at all appropriate for the reference at the bottom. So what we will want our model to do, which you can see on the next slide, is to really only grasp the tokens of the concept that are that relate to the thing that we want to examine, the meaning, the concept that we want to examine. So we want to disentangle all this onomasiological, semantical information so that we can just focus on the formal onomasiological variation parts. And the model would do this by using contextual information, so those context words that Mariana talked about, so that the tokens belonging to the target concept of high temperature are automatically distinguished from other uses of the words heat and warm. Or if we would apply to this picture, the aim would be to focus on only the tokens of trousers and pants that relate to garments going from waist to knees or ankle, and not on the tokens of pants referring to underpants. So that's what we're going to try to get our model to do. And then I think Mariana can talk about the case study.
Yeah. So we are here going to extend the case study of heat and to the same data that we already looked at with hit. We're going to combine it with occurrences of bottom. So they both can have this hot meaning or translation to English. And the question is then, where is there overlap between their contexts or where they are different? So one of the notions that we're going to have that we have is this of the envelope of variation. So the set of concepts in which either hit or warm can be used. But we still have to see, so in which cases only hit is used or only warm or both of them, and whether they still have the same meaning when they're applied to the same context or not. So a further complication to what Karlien was saying, and that comes up a lot in the discussions of this onomasiological research, is how do you define the concept that you're going to analyze? To what degree is this the concept? So if you have the word of breeches, so are you studying the breeches or are you studying the trousers? Can you use trousers to mention breeches? Which is the concept that you're going to really look at? So we are going to illustrate this case study and show what the clouds say, and I'm going to talk about what we know about linguistics of temperature that can help us understand this, but the actual final conclusions, we are not going to give them. This is mostly illustrative, is to keep thinking. We're not going to give you the answer. So this is the cloud. You can see that it's totally different. Yeah, it's not the cloud of hit that then we added a cloud of bottom. We regenerated everything. So instead of having the distances between the tokens of hit, we have the distances between the tokens of hit and bottom. And those are the ones that the algorithm tried to group. And again, think of this party, and now you have instances of hit and bottom. And there are some instances of hit that now are friends with some instances of bottom, and then others that still don't have friends from bottom. And we can see, so here in this plot, the colors are not the groups anymore. I have a color for hit and a color for bottom. So the orange points are instances of hit. The blue points are instances of bottom. The groups are normally characterized by a specific context word. But as I mentioned before, sometimes that context is very strong. That is the case of the red table. And in other cases, there is not just that context word, but that context word and some other friends are similar words. And we can see is that some of the groups are exclusively or almost exclusively made of tokens of hit. So there are contexts that occur with hit and do not occur with bottom. And then there's also the other way around, groups that are mostly with bottom and are not occurring with hit. And there are clusters or groups, it's the same thing, that occur with some of them and not with the others. There are clusters that occur with both hit and bottom in different proportions. A main side is there is nothing super categorical here. There can always be an extra one from the other one. There's not a black and white thing here. It's tendencies, it's preferences, it's weights. And this is the quantitative points. And an interesting thing of, we're looking at 600 instances of hit and bottom in a corpus, and we can make observations or conclusions based on the overall behavior that we see here, on the tendencies and how they behave. Things that only 3 tokens, for example, wouldn't really give us an idea of. So what are these groups represented by? We have 4 clusters that are characterized by context words, but these context words which already saw, like Adam, Aardappel, Hangijzer, and Boter. So bread, potato, pot hanger, and butter. The 3 first, we already saw their idiomatic expressions that are with hit. So makes sense that they don't occur with bottom. And the case of butter is basically the same example as we saw with in before. It's a cluster of different ingredients and kitchen stuff. So we have here on the top the hangijzer, and we have the aardappel and butter, and you could have seen maybe in the other plot as well, even though the aardappel, the potato case, is idiomatic, the word potato for the model is similar to the other food words. So it says there's a lot of potatoes here and they group together, but the group of potatoes is close to the group of the other foods because potato is similar to the other foods. So this is also important in the visualization tool that we have. You can hover over the points and you will see the different contexts. So you can more or less see what is bringing the different tokens together, the different instances, and how just looking at the model doesn't tell you this is an idiomatic expression, this is this sense. You have to get your interpretation and understand what is going on here. So these are the cases that are going mostly with hits, this hot sense. Then in the case of warm, we have heart, and this, we're going to see an example later of a warm heart towards something. We have weather, we have degree, which is normally in expressions of weather. So here you can see to the right that the cloud of weather, and the clouds of grad, degree, are very close together. And they are very different contexts in which, so in this case of degree, as you will see later, is something like the weather is 5 degrees hotter than yesterday, stuff like that. And then there's example with the verb make, to make, which is not, so in the Spanish translation can be confusing for Spanish speaker. It's not the weather, it is hot, that is not hace calor. It's to make someone, to warm someone up to a certain idea, to make them passionate about something. Well, Karlien would explain from the example. That was my interpretation. And then there are groups. Then there are groups over here that have a bit of both. So we have in the case of cold, and that is hot co-occurs with cold. So both heat and warm. And you see that there's a lighter color because it's mostly warm, but also heat that co-occurs with cold. And you will see that it's in an expression that is, this doesn't leave me cold or hot. This doesn't touch me. I don't care. Then there is coffee, which is actually a group of coffee, tea, chocolate milk, and very similar things to coffee. And as you can see, it's also close to potatoes and other ingredients, but it's mostly liquids that we prefer hot. Then there's water, which is also close by. And then here, when we're getting to the bottom, are going to groups where they still both warm and heat, but with preferences for heat. So there's also summer and other weather, season in times, and then to be, which is this huge group in the middle that is a mess and is grouped by, predicative uses, like pretty much all the rest. You can also see that these make and hard cases, which are metaphorical extensions of one, which are not metaphorical extensions of it, also have their own group. So on one hand, we have groups that are characterized by one or a few similar words, but we also can see whether the groups are close together or not. And one key difference between doing this or just having collocations is that this one lets you know whether the collocations co-occur with each other or not. So you can see that there is a group of hangäser and another group of potato, and that's the pot hanger and the potato don't meet. You don't have the groups together. But also you can have groups characterized by similar context words. So there is butter, oil, neither of them is strong enough to have their own cluster. They come together with a cluster that, is called butter, but it's made of all the butter and the oil and the pans and all their kitchen things. So that is something that collocational analysis would miss. So to have a brief overview of the context, so we don't take so much time, these are the contexts I have the preference for one. So in the case of degree, we have this kind of expression of like something is 10 degrees warmer or hotter, but it's mostly weather related. Then we have the actual word weather. And then we have this metaphorical extension. So Karlien, would you like to explain the metaphorical expressions?
Yeah, so to have a warm heart or warm hart hebben voor iets is basically to be, to have a positive attitude towards it, or a really positive, I mean, it's more than just positive, like feeling really good about it. And then the one with maken, so with to make in English, is to make someone enthusiastic about something. So you heat up their spirits basically, and you make them interested. So those are.
We're trying to do with the audience.
Yeah, kind of like that.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to give some comments about this from the linguistics of temperature. Then these are the examples that occur with both head and warm. We're not going through all of them because, time. But you can ask for the slides and we'll show you which are the cases. And so we have this expression of not getting hot or cold about something. The coffee, which also can be tea or something else. Water, summer, and then to be. And you had your own. So this is what the corpus says, and we also have information that I'm not adding here about how much of a preference is. So in some cases it's 10 against 6, and in other cases it's 20 against 22. So Karlien, you had some thoughts about the case of gout, for example, right?
About gout.
The palm of gout versus head of gout.
Yeah. So. Worm of gout seems, well, actually in this example I don't really see it, but I feel like it's more idiomatic, right? It's not literally hot or cold, but it's like it's getting hot or cold in English.
Yes.
And the opposition or the antinomy between the words is complicated. I would say that warm is an antonym of gout, and hot isn't really, but still it co-occurs with it, which is interesting in itself. But I think we can go to the next slide because we don't have a lot of time anymore.
Yeah. So I'm going to briefly give you an idea of something that can help us understand what's going on here. So there is a very nice edited book by Koptskaya from 2015 about linguistics of temperature. It has a very useful introduction and a lot of papers studying the terms used to talk about temperature in different languages. So it's a typological study. It's very, very well, and a lot of small studies that bring together a typological perspective. And if you think about temperature, it's often a very typical example of gradual antonymy. Yeah, you have cold, cool, warm, hot, lukewarm in the middle. And that's only what we talk about in terms of temperature values, like something is hotter or colder than something else. Cognitive semantics, for example, well, this idea of the bodily experience lets us know that there's actually much more to temperature than that. So there's a different experience, the tactile temperature, to touch something that is hot or that is cold. That's different from the bodily sensation that I am feeling hot or cold. And it's different from the ambient temperature of it is hot outside or it is cold outside. In the case of English, and I think there's a problem of being so focused on English. English has the same grammatical structure and word for the three things. This is hot, it is hot outside, I am hot. In Spanish, for example, you have different words and syntactic structures for all three kinds of temperature frames. And you can also have different adjectives. So the difference between caliente and caluroso is because one is for tactile temperature and the other one is for ambient temperature. But also you have hace calor, which is an expression to say that it is hot outside, and that is a syntactic structure that you pretty much have it only for that and for time expressions. It's very specific. And so there are certain patterns across linguistics, across different languages to talk about these different temperature frames. And then we also have evaluated entities. So we don't care about the temperature of all the entities. A classical example is who cares about the temperature of the ceiling? You never touch it, you never think about it. Or even about a book. You don't talk about the temperature of a book because it's not a conductive material, so you never really feel hot or cold or anything in a book. There are things for which the temperature is very important. Water is used in different aspects of our life with different temperatures, whether you're taking a bath, whether you're drinking it, whether making a baby take a bath, when it's all these different things. Water is very important. As you can see, it has its own cluster in our clouds. Yes, and coffee is important, but also within coffee, for example, they have expectations, so you expect the coffee to be hot, but if you have the Coca-Cola at the same temperature, but also if you have the Coca-Cola or the coffee at 20 degrees, the Coca-Cola is too hot for what you want, or too warm, you would say, and the tea is too cold. And so we have these experiences and expressions, and it becomes very relative. So the adjectives are always relative and relative to these experiences and these perspectives, these expectations. So we can use this to more or less understand what is going on here, in that the distinction between het and warm. So how do you define the concepts where het and warm coincide or interact? Yes, because you have these cases where het and warm can be applied to the same things, like in the case of water, coffee, or in this expression of God, they might not have exactly the same, they don't refer to the same temperature, but also they have tendencies to different temperature frames. So the fact that the weather and degrees are more with warm means that warm has a preference for this ambient temperature, while het has this preference for tactile temperature, which are not absolute. You can also use het for ambient temperature. You can also use warm for tactile temperature. So, but they have these preferences, these ways that we can see here. And this also is translated to the metaphorical extensions. So het is used for metaphorical extensions that have to do with something new or something dangerous or something conflictive, which is the kind of metaphorical extension that comes from tactile hot, something that is dangerous, you don't want to touch it, that can hurt you, but it's not really going to kill you. In the case of warm, it is related to the coziness warm of being like with a blanket in a cold day or a hug, and that's the kind of metaphorical extensions that you will get with warm, like affection, for example, and we have that also in English, and we have that in Spanish, and it's very interesting to be able to look at this from all those different perspectives, even in the case of the metaphorical extensions, because it's not just het is hotter than warm, which is in some cases when they are together, when they can't really alternate for the same kind of context. It's also that they have preferences for different temperature frames. And in the case of water, for example, it can be equally warm or of het, because it occurs in so many contexts in which sometimes you want it to be hot, sometimes you want it to be warm, or you can be in different temperatures as important. Yeah, that was it. Sorry. So what I just said is these slides, basically. So all the three dimensions are important, and we can use these quantitative methods to highlight how they have different tendencies to different aspects. We want to thank you, all of you, for watching. If you stayed until now. We also want to thank the organization of the conference and the interpreters. It has been quite an adventure. If you want the slides with all the references, you can just send us an email or ask Nuria and she will send us an email.
Thank you very much. This was wonderful. Really brilliant conference. The perspective you propose is inspiring and open-minded in different ways. People in the chats of both broadcasts at the same time spoke of many words of praise, and they have questions. So if you don't mind, I will read just a couple. Okay, perfect. First,
it took much longer than we thought.
You'd like to make a question?
No. I'm thinking that it took much longer than we thought it would be.
No,
so,
that's
go ahead with the questions.
Okay, don't worry. Computational methods are exciting and, more importantly, inevitable. But should we also be cautious on its possibilities and scope? The person that asked is interested on your thoughts, because you seem to be very thoughtful of this matter.
Yes, that's a very important question. Yeah, I'll answer first, Karlien.
Yeah, can you just, so the scope of models.
Yeah, if we should be careful, I understand of the scope of it. And that's definitely the center of our research. So this is, in computational methods, word embeddings, which use neural networks, are much more popular than what we're doing here. And we are focusing on this method precisely because kind of more transparent, and because we are not assuming that they tell any truth. So we are looking into what is it that they're really saying and how we can interpret it. And we're not taking, so on the one hand, we are not taking really semantic annotation as a gold standard either yet. We're just seeing what the models say and what we can learn from them and how we can interpret them. Being very careful of where the information comes from and how to, and that's what we are interested in. So we don't think that every linguist will be interested in digging into the computational and mathematical stuff to figure out, but that's what we're doing to be able to explain to people. And that's really an important warning also. I think, for example, the word that the tackling group yesterday was presenting is amazing. And they gave a lot of warning of this is beta, we are not sure, this can be, they can have problems, and that's very important. With everything that says AI or whatever, be very careful because it's sometimes built in a lot of assumptions that are not really true with the corpus data. So yes, we definitely endorse that.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that other than, you'll always need a linguist. I mean, you have to be the linguist and a computer that can do the hard calculations for you, but you can't assume that a computer knows language because it just doesn't, or doesn't yet. We don't know. We're still very careful with trusting all computational methods without thinking about it for ourselves.
Yes, and that is a kind of warning of the artificial intelligence that not all the linguistics are aware of.
It's true. Yeah.
Some people trust blindly on the results, and that's a problem. Why did you specifically choose a newspaper corpus? The person that asked is wondering what's the theoretical basis for that decision?
Should I? So the newspaper corpus, it's theoretical but also pragmatic. Pragmatic. Theoretically, the corpus is really interesting for us in particular because we are interested in lexical variation in the different varieties of Dutch and also in different registers so that we can look at processes of standardization over time, for instance, or how people in the Netherlands speak differently than people in Flanders. And there's also an interesting social cultural history there that influences our standard language. So that is why we have the corpus. And what is also convenient about it is that it's really big. So we can actually apply our methods to it, because that's often a problem with many computational methods, is that you need a lot of data to make them work, to make them at least somewhat reliable. And so by using this corpus that we have, which we are still planning to answer some of our research questions with these methods, but it turns out we can't trust them as much as we may have thought in the beginning of the project. But so that is really the reason why we went with the newspapers, because it has the stratification that we need for the type of lexical variation that we're interested in Leuven, I think. I don't know if you have anything to add, Mariana.
I think I would add that sometimes you don't necessarily have a theoretical justification for the corpus you're using. It's what you have. You need a huge corpus for this kind of research, and you don't always have all the availability of corpora that you would need. And so there's people that build corpora, and there's people that try to work with a corpora, and sometimes, so building a corpus that adjusts to your needs is a research project in itself. It's a lot of resources. So sometimes I think it's safe. Well, I think it's valid to sometimes justify using a corpus because that's the corpus that you have access to. As long as you are clear about what corpus you're using, so that people know what is the extent of the results that you're giving. So what are you talking about? And we don't make any claim that newspapers represent the full of language. No, they represent the language of newspapers in Flanders and in that time. And that is a very important thing. And I think it's something that at the beginning of corpus linguistics, there was all this discussion of how representative corpora are. And now there's more this idea of like, it's never going to be representative. It's just representative of whatever it is representative. Just be honest about that. And then we'll build a richer picture together with different corpora that we can, as we're going to get being. Just, I think that also addresses a bit the concern of who asked the question.
That's a big contrast if you compare this perspective with the Real Academia or las academias in general, that they say this is the way we speak, this is the normative, and it never reflects the real way the people speak. So this is. I believe, this is my opinion, that this is a new way, not exactly new, but it's a new way of perceiving the language. And this is, I think this will open a new perspective for the linguistics as a professional. That is not only the people that it's in the academy or it's in the lab, and that's all. I think these perspectives are opening spaces in the linguistic area of different matters and different areas of science. Do you think that this will change the paradigm?
Well, it is already changing it. It's a matter of where you see the groups. And I think that corpus linguistics were, or at least in my experience, in trying to do corpus linguistics and not being partially encouraged to do it or not so much. So, because here, for example, in Belgium, corpus linguistics is much more established. It's much more of the norm in many groups, but that's not the case always. And I think it has to do partially with resources, whether you have access to corpora or not, or to the computational power, and also to the interaction of having here a research group where you can hire an informatician, which that's a matter of resources and sometimes gets taken for granted in some groups. But also this idea of, because that's the kind of arguments that I've heard of, like, no, I want to have interpretation and the quality and the numbers can be manipulated, or that these are numbers and it's so cold and there's no the interpretation in between. And I think that it's important to teach how that's not really the case, and what is opened by quantitative methods, by corpus methods, by using actual language and large amounts of language. And I think it's important for us to think of how much of what we think we know about language actually comes from these introspective descriptions or these normative descriptions. And you have all these images of how language works and how the meanings of a word, and then you go look at a corpus, you see a concordance and everything breaks. And I think this is a very, very important and interesting experience to have. So whether that's changing paradigms, it depends on where. There are some places where this paradigm is already in the way of changing. So cognitive social linguistics has its years already, and there's a lot of, right, Karlien?
There's quite a lot, yeah. So I think you're right. I think it's changing some parts of linguistics, but for this idea that, we shouldn't believe too much in prescriptivism, for that to enter into the broader society of, people who use language. So not the linguists, that is going to take a while, I think. For people to realize that language variation is okay and not a problem, or you don't sound bad if you use a dialect or whatever. That it takes more work, I think. But hopefully it'll happen. That would be great.
Baby steps.
Yeah, baby steps, exactly.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much also Valeria Dorrego and Pilar Petrone, our interpreters, and Carolina Crespo that was in the other broadcast. This is the first time we do this, so it was quite a challenge, and I'm proud. I'm proud of you.
It was very grateful. It was a very great experience for us. Thank you.
Yes.
I will never forget this. This is the real first one. This is a baptism. Well, thank you very much. See you on the next module on glottopolitics. There are 3 specialists ready to start. See you in the next chapter.
Thank you very much. Bye.